The coral sands of Tarawa were littered with twisted metal and the acrid scent of burning oil. It was November 1943. The Pacific sun beat down like a furnace as U.S. Marines pushed inland. Rifles raised, eyes searching for the enemy among shattered palm trunks and smoking pillboxes. Through the haze, they spotted it, a small olive-green tank slumped half-buried in sand. Its gun pointed uselessly toward the sea. A Japanese Type 95 Heigo light tank, the pride of an empire's armored forces, lay dead and silent. One Marine fired a burst from his Browning .50 caliber into the hull. Out of instinct more than caution, the bullets punched clean through both sides of the armor. The men froze. Then they laughed, not out of mockery but disbelief. Their machine gun rounds had sliced through a tank as if it were tin. That moment, caught between laughter and horror, marked a revelation. Japan's armor was no match for modern firepower. And behind that fragile shell was a story of doctrine, desperation, and fatal pride. In the early 1930s, Japan stood at a crossroads. Its empire was expanding across Asia, its army emboldened by swift victories in Manchuria and northern China. The world was watching an island nation transform into a militarized power, and at the heart of its ambition was mobility. The Imperial Japanese Army had learned hard lessons in the rugged hills of Manchuria. Roads were few, the terrain unforgiving, and logistics a nightmare. What they needed wasn't a heavy lumbering tank. They needed something light, something that could move fast, cross rice paddies, and support infantry far from supply lines. Thus was born the Type 95 Heigo, a light tank in every sense. In 1935, when it rolled off Mitsubishi's production line, the Heigo was seen as modern, even elegant. Weighing just over 7 tons, it was a third the weight of the American M4 Sherman that would later face it. Its 37mm Type 94 gun could easily destroy the outdated armor of Chinese warlords or rebel forces. Against riflemen and machine guns, it was invincible, but there was a flaw, a fatal one. The Heigo's armor was barely 12mm thick on the front and just 6 on the sides. Even rifle-caliber rounds could penetrate it at close range. Yet, for Japan's generals in the 1930s, that wasn't a concern. They saw tanks not as duelists, but as infantry support weapons, mobile gun platforms meant to break resistance, not fight other tanks. This mindset stemmed from Japan's wars on the Asian mainland. In China, their armored columns rolled unchallenged through mud and city streets, crushing weak opposition. Air superiority and infantry coordination were the decisive factors, not armor. So, the doctrine hardened. Speed and aggression were armor enough. By 1939, when the Heigo faced the Soviet Union at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, that belief was tested and shattered. Soviet BT-7 and T-26 tanks, with thicker armor and superior guns, decimated Japanese armor in the Mongolian steppe. At Nomonhan, Haigos burst into flames under Soviet fire, their crews incinerated before they could even turn their turrets. The defeat should have been a warning. But Japan's military leadership, still fixated on the Pacific's islands and jungles, dismissed it as a one-off disaster. They believed the Soviet plains and the Pacific archipelagos were worlds apart. In their eyes, the Heigo was still perfectly suited for the kind of wars Japan expected to fight: swift island invasions, infantry-heavy battles, and colonial policing actions. Meanwhile, in the West, the world was changing. In Europe, German panzers rolled into Poland, then France, showcasing a new kind of mechanized warfare, blitzkrieg. Armor was no longer a support element. It was the spearhead. The tank had evolved from a rolling bunker into a decisive weapon of shock and momentum. Yet in Tokyo, tradition ruled over innovation. Resources were scarce, and Japan's industry struggled to keep up with naval demands. The Imperial Navy devoured steel and fuel, leaving the Army's armored branch underfunded and politically sidelined. The result was stagnation. The Heigo remained in production well into the 1940s with minimal upgrades. The same thin plates, the same 37mm gun, the same vulnerability. To the Japanese soldiers, though it was still a symbol of power. In propaganda films, it rumbled proudly across parades and training fields. Young tank crews, barely in their 20s, trained in cramped, sweltering interiors, believing they were the steel fist of the Emperor's will. They couldn't know that across the ocean. American engineers were designing tanks 5 times heavier, with guns capable of shredding the Hago from a mile away. The world was racing toward total mechanized war, but Japan's armor, like its doctrine, was still fighting yesterday's battles, and when the war reached the islands of the Pacific, that difference would become brutally, tragically clear. By 1942, the Pacific War had exploded into full scale. Pearl Harbor was still fresh in memory, and Japan's empire stretched like a crimson stain across the map, from the Philippines to Malaya, from Burma to the Solomons. For a time it looked unstoppable, but beneath the triumphs lay fragility. Japan's industrial foundation was shallow. Every tank, every plane, every shell cost precious steel and oil, resources now choked by Allied blockades. As the war spread, Japan's armored forces were forced to fight not just enemies, but economics. The Type 95 Hago, once Japan's pride, was showing its age. Its 37mm gun could still shatter bunkers and tear through light trucks, but by 1942, it was hopelessly outmatched. American M3 Stuarts and later M4 Shermans could shrug off its shells with ease. The Hago's thin armor made it vulnerable to almost anything. Anti-tank rifles, grenades, even concentrated machine gun fire. Still, Japan kept sending it into battle. Not because they believed in it, but because they had no alternative. The strategic disconnect. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy operated as rival empires within an empire. Each had its own doctrine, its own priorities, and its own industrial fiefdoms. The Navy demanded ships and planes for decisive battles. The Army fought for steel scraps to build tanks, and in this bureaucratic tug-of-war, innovation suffocated. When American forces began deploying the Sherman, a 30-ton beast with a 75mm gun, Japan's engineers pleaded for thicker armor, bigger guns, and better engines. But the requests were denied or delayed. Factories lacked the capacity to produce heavy armor plating in sufficient quantities. Japan's island economy simply couldn't mass-produce what its strategists imagined, so the Hago endured, a relic forced into a modern war, terrain and tactics in fairness. Japan's commanders argued that tanks had little role in the Pacific's jungles and coral atolls. Dense vegetation, soft ground, and narrow roads limited movement. Infantry, artillery, and air power seemed more decisive. But this reasoning ignored one crucial fact. The Americans adapted U.S. Marine engineers carved roads from coral, built makeshift bridges, and modified their tanks for amphibious assaults. They brought armor where no one thought tanks could go. Tarawa, Saipan, Palaliu, and when Japanese Hagos tried to meet them, it was like watching the Stone Age charge. The industrial encounters in the field reports from Guadalcanal and the Philippines tell the same grim story. Hagos emerged from tree lines or trenches, guns blazing, only to be stopped dead by bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, or even concentrated rifle fire. At Guadalcanal in 1942, a platoon of Hagos attempted to overrun Marine positions near the Matanikau River. Within minutes, most were burning. Marines realized that even the Browning .50 caliber, a weapon designed for aircraft and light vehicles, could rip through the tank's armor like foil. By the time of Tarawa in late 1943, the lesson was clear. The Hago wasn't a tank anymore. It was a coffin on treads. Yet the men inside them still fought with suicidal courage. At Saipan in June 1944, Japanese tankers launched a desperate counterattack at night. 44 Hagos and Chihas charging into U.S. Marine lines illuminated by flares. The result was annihilation. None made it back. The beaches were littered with burning wrecks. Their crews still at the controls. The Hago had become a weapon of defiance, not victory. Doctrine meets reality. The contrast between American and Japanese armor philosophy was now complete. For the U.S., the tank was a tool of dominance, massed, supported, and evolving. For Japan, it remained a symbol of valor, outdated, heroic, and tragic. Every encounter, from the Philippines to Okinawa, revealed the same truth. Japan's technological courage had run headlong into industrial reality. The laughter of Marines at Tarawa wasn't mockery. It was disbelief, a recognition that one side was fighting the war of 1944, and the other was still fighting the war of 1934. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would define this imbalance. When the Hago rolled out for its final, doomed charge against the might of the United States Marines. The human angle. Inside the Hago, imagine being a Japanese tanker in 1944. The inside of a Type 95 was barely large enough for 3 men. No insulation, no real ventilation, no radios. Just the clatter of gears, the choking smell of gasoline, and the deafening bark of the engine inches from your spine. The commander doubled as the gunner. The driver and machine gunner worked blind through slits in the armor. The temperature could soar past 120 degrees, and the noise was constant, a mechanical scream in a steel cage. These crews were often young, 19, 20 years old, trained in loyalty and obedience rather than mechanical mastery. They called their machines Teketsu no Uma, horses of iron and blood. To them, the Hago was not a weapon of conquest, but a means of sacrifice. In the jungles of Luzon or the coral flats of Tarawa, they knew what they faced. They had seen what American firepower could do. Yet when orders came, they climbed into those tanks without hesitation. Many crews carried their family flags inside, inscribed with prayers. May you bring honor to the Emperor. When the first 50 caliber bullets punched through the hulls, the men inside didn't scream. They couldn't. There was no air left to breathe. It wasn't just a battle between machines. It was youth colliding with industrial fate. The technological angle, the anatomy of vulnerability, the Hago's technical simplicity was both its strength and its curse. Its Mitsubishi diesel engine, air-cooled and reliable, could handle jungle heat. It required minimal maintenance, and it could cross rough terrain that heavier Allied tanks couldn't. In the early 1930s, this was innovation, but by the 1940s, it was suicide. The armor? 6 to 12 millimeters of riveted steel. A 50 caliber round from a Browning M2 could punch clean through from 300 yards. The main gun, a 37mm Type 94, had a muzzle velocity of around 575 meters per second, effective against soft targets, but almost useless against the armor of an M3 Stuart or M4 Sherman. Its speed, up to 45 km/h, meant little when the battlefield turned into a cauldron of artillery, airstrikes and flamethrowers. And its riveted hull, when struck by high-caliber rounds, often became a death trap. The rivets would shear off and ricochet inside the cabin like shrapnel, killing the crew even if the armor wasn't penetrated. No radios meant isolation. Crews communicated with flags, hand signals, or sheer guesswork. In a modern battle where coordination meant survival, the Hago was fighting blind. When Marines on Tarawa or Guam inspected captured Hagos, their reports were half disbelief, half pity. It's like shooting through a car, one U.S. officer wrote. A car with people who won't get out. For Japan, every Hago lost was a blow not only to its armored strength, but to its illusion of parity. The enemy's eyes, the Marines' perspective, for the U.S. Marines. The first encounters with Japanese armor were surreal. They had expected the kind of tanks they'd seen in Europe, solid, intimidating, dangerous. Instead, they met thin-skinned machines that seemed fragile by comparison. At Guadalcanal, when a Hago advanced through the mist toward Marine lines, men braced for impact, then stared as their 50 caliber rounds punched through both sides. Some thought it was a fluke. They fired again. Same result. In the heat of battle, soldiers joked to hide their shock. You could take it down with a screwdriver, one Marine quipped. Another called it the world's angriest tin can. But beneath the humor was a sobering realization. The Japanese tankers weren't fools. They knew what they were driving into, and they did it anyway. After the fighting, Marines sometimes approached the wrecks out of curiosity. Inside, they found burned photos, neatly folded letters, family flags. The laughter faded. The war machine they had mocked was suddenly human again. The enemy's steel tomb. That strange mixture of grim awe and reluctant respect defined the American view of the Hago. It wasn't a threat. It was a tragedy on tracks. The Marines' laughter would fade completely once they saw what desperation looked like. When those fragile tanks charged into American fire by the dozens, not out of hope, but out of duty. The tactical angle. How it was supposed to work, the Type 95 Hago wasn't built for duels. It was designed for movement. In Japanese tactical doctrine, tanks weren't independent predators like the German panzers. They were infantry companions, extensions of foot soldiers, meant to move ahead, machine guns blazing, and suppress defenses so infantry could follow. A platoon of Hagos, usually 3 to 5 tanks, would advance in a shallow V formation. The lead tank engaged bunkers, the rest flanked. Infantry followed closely behind, ready to exploit any breach. Against Chinese warlord troops or colonial garrisons, this worked. The Hagos' thin armor and small gun were irrelevant when the enemy had no tanks of their own. But that same doctrine collapsed in the Pacific. At Tarawa, there was nowhere to flank. On Saipan, every approach was covered by anti-tank guns or Shermans. The Hagos' small silhouette, once an advantage, now meant nothing when American spotters could call in naval gunfire within minutes. The Japanese command never developed large-scale armored tactics for the Pacific. Instead, they relied on valor over volume. Every engagement was local, desperate, and often suicidal. In that sense, the Hago wasn't a weapon. It was an idea, the belief that courage could substitute for steel. The psychological angle, when pride becomes armor in Japanese. Military culture of the 1930s and 40s. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, shaped everything. Honor outweighed survival, defeat was unthinkable, and surrender was worse than death. For tank crews, this ethos was suffocatingly literal. They were told their machines were superior, that the spirit of the Japanese soldier would overcome any technological difference. Better to burn in your tank, one officer told recruits, than to live in shame. When the first reports came from Guadalcanal that American weapons were cutting through Hagos like paper, disbelief set in. Some commanders blamed poor discipline. Others insisted the tanks hadn't been used correctly. Few acknowledged the truth. The Hago had outlived its time. By 1944, many Japanese tankers went into battle knowing their machines were death traps. They packed their tanks with extra ammunition and sometimes carried explosives to destroy themselves if captured. There are accounts of crews deliberately ramming American positions, choosing immolation over surrender. The psychological armor was unbreakable until it met the real kind. The leadership and doctrine angle, a nation at cross purposes. The tragedy of the Hago was not in its steel but in its leadership. Japan's military was divided between two competing visions. The Imperial Army, fixated on land war in Asia, and the Imperial Navy, obsessed with maritime supremacy. The result was chaos in planning, logistics, and production. While the Navy consumed the majority of industrial output, ships, aircraft carriers, and Zero fighters, the Army was left to make do with scraps. The result was an armored corps that looked more like a museum exhibit than a modern force. Worse still, Japan's high command refused to integrate tank warfare into its overall strategy. There was no Japanese Guderian, no Patton, no one pushing for combined arms tactics. Tank divisions existed mostly on paper. Communication between armor and infantry relied on shouts or flares, while American forces had radios in nearly every vehicle. By 1943, Japan's engineers had already designed heavier tanks, the Chihei, the Chinu, even the prototype OI Super Heavy tank. But they existed in blueprints and test fields, not on the beaches where men were dying. There simply weren't the resources to produce them. So, when the Hagos rolled out for battle, they weren't just outdated, they were symptoms of a leadership paralyzed by delusion. In Tokyo, bureaucrats spoke of the spiritual victory of the East. In the Pacific, Marines were proving that firepower doesn't believe in philosophy. As the islands burned and Japan's perimeter shrank, the Hago's fate became a symbol of the empire itself, fragile, determined, and doomed by its own illusions. And then came the moment that sealed that fate forever, when these tanks met their destruction in one of the Pacific War's most brutal showdowns. It was November 20th, 1943. The lagoon at Tarawa shimmered under a brutal Pacific sun, its turquoise waters hiding coral reefs that would soon run red. The American invasion, Operation Galvanic, had begun. The 2nd Marine Division was landing on Betio Island, a narrow strip of sand just 3 miles long, fortified by thousands of Japanese defenders. Among them were several Type 95 Hago light tanks of the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, positioned behind coconut log bunkers and trenches. For the Japanese, this was sacred ground. They had sworn that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. For the Marines, it would take just 76 hours at an unbearable cost. The first clashes. The first waves of Marines waded ashore under a hail of machine gun and mortar fire. The Hagos rumbled into action. Their small diesel engines coughed to life, and they rolled forward across the airfield, sand spraying from their treads. From the American perspective, they looked almost toy-like, squat, noisy, and strangely slow against the backdrop of chaos. But when they opened fire, those 37mm shells screamed across the beach, shattering palm logs and tearing through landing craft. The Marines hit back. Browning .50 caliber machine guns tore through the tank's thin armor. In one famous account, Sergeant William Bordelon and his squad opened fire from behind a wrecked amphibious tractor, their bullets punching straight through a Hago's turret. The tank stopped, smoke curling from its hatches. Inside, the crew never had a chance. Moments later, a bazooka team took aim at another Hago trying to flank the beachhead. The rocket struck the engine deck, and the tank erupted in flames. The rest tried to maneuver, but the coral sand trapped them, their treads spinning helplessly as Marines closed in. By the end of the second day, all of Tarawa's Hagos were gone, blackened skeletons scattered among shattered palms. The shock of realization. For the U.S. Marines, it was a strange victory. They had expected a harder fight from the tanks. Instead, they found machines that fell apart under weapons meant for aircraft. After the battle, Marines inspected the wrecks. Many were astonished at how thin the armor was, barely thicker than a car door. A war correspondent wrote, "You could see daylight through the holes made by our guns." It wasn't even a contest. That image, daylight shining through the armor of a tank, became a symbol of how uneven the Pacific War had become. But for the Japanese defenders, the destruction of their armor was no surprise. Many had gone into the battle knowing they were outmatched. Their tanks weren't meant to win. They were meant to delay, to make the Americans bleed for every yard of coral, and they succeeded. By the time Betio was declared secure, over 1,000 Marines were dead, and nearly 4,000 Japanese defenders had been annihilated to the last man. Tarawa proved that America could win island battles, but at a terrible cost. It also exposed just how far behind Japan's armor had fallen. The beginning of the end in the aftermath, U.S. intelligence officers studied the remains of the Hago. They noted its small profile, light construction, and the riveted seams that made it so vulnerable. Obsolete, one report read, but used with fanatic courage. That phrase, fanatic courage, would echo again and again in Marine reports across the Pacific because the Hago hadn't made its final stand yet. The next test would come on the island of Saipan in June 1944. There, Japan would throw everything it had left into a counterattack that would make Tarawa look like a prelude. Hundreds of tanks, Hagos, Chiha mediums, and anything that could move would charge headlong into American armor and artillery. It would be the largest tank battle of the Pacific War, and it would end the same way. Fire, ruin, and silence. The island of Saipan, June 17, 1944. A crescent of jungle and volcanic ridges rising from the Pacific, its beaches still trembling from naval bombardment. The U.S. invasion was underway, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, along with the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division, clawing their way inland under fire. For Japan, Saipan was not just another island. It was a doorstep to the home islands. Losing it meant exposing the empire's heart to American bombers. The order from Tokyo was clear: hold at all costs. The Night of Steel and Fire A's American forces dug in near the village of Tanapag. The Japanese 9th Tank Regiment prepared for a counterattack. They had around 44 tanks, mostly Type 97 Chihas and the lighter Hagos. Their commander, Colonel Nakagawa, knew the odds were hopeless. But he also knew what the emperor demanded: Gyokusai, the honorable death. At 0300 hours, engines roared to life in the darkness. The ground shook as the tanks rolled forward, a thunderous mechanical wave. Crews tied white headbands across their foreheads, some whispering prayers, others shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai." Long live the Emperor. Ahead of them, Marines slept in foxholes, exhausted after 2 days of constant fighting. The first warning came not from sound but vibration, the low tremor of tracks across coral. Then came the glow, muzzle flashes in the dark, tracer rounds cutting through palm trees. The Marines sprang to life. Searchlights flickered on. Bazookas and machine guns roared. What unfolded next was the largest tank assault of the Pacific War. The battle in the dark, the Hagos came first, smaller, faster, their engines whining like angry wasps. Their 37mm guns fired wildly, muzzle flashes dancing in the dark. But the Shermans were waiting. A Marine gunner on Hill 500 described it. They came at us like a storm, but our guns went straight through them. One shot, and the whole tank went up like a match. Sherman crews fired point blank into the charging line. Bazooka teams aimed for the silhouettes. Some Hagos exploded instantly. Others kept moving even after their turrets were blown off, momentum carrying the dead forward. When daylight broke, the battlefield looked like a scrapyard from hell. Dozens of Hagos and Chihas lay burning across the field, their hulls twisted and blackened. The ground steamed with oil and blood. By 700, the attack was over. Not one Japanese tank had survived. The turning point in doctrine for Japan's military observers, those few who lived to report back, Saipan was a revelation and a funeral. The old belief that spirit conquers steel had been incinerated in the night. The Hago, once the proud spear of Japan's mechanized arm, was now a liability, a symbol of a doctrine that had refused to evolve. Tokyo's response was to promise newer, heavier tanks, the Type 3 Chinu, the Type 4 Chito. On paper, these designs could rival the Sherman, but the factories building them were under constant bombardment. By 1945, only a handful existed, none ever reaching the front. Meanwhile, the Marines, hardened now, efficient, relentless, advanced from island to island, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Each time the Hago reappeared briefly, only to be annihilated again. The human cost. When American soldiers inspected the wrecks after Saipan, they found haunting remnants. Inside one Hago, the crew had been burned alive, their hands still gripping the controls. Another had its hatch welded shut from the inside. The men had chosen to die in place rather than retreat. Marine Captain Frank Keating later wrote, "Their bravery was not in question. But bravery can't stop a 75mm shell." That line captured the entire Pacific Armor War. Japan had courage, but America had industry. And in modern war, courage alone dies first. The symbolic death of the Hago after Saipan, the Type 95, ceased to be a weapon of war. It became a ghost of strategy, a reminder of what happens when doctrine outlives reality. In 1945, during the defense of Okinawa, a few surviving Hagos were dug into the ground as makeshift bunkers, buried up to their turrets. They weren't tanks anymore. They were tombs waiting to be filled. The laughter that once greeted the sight of their pierced hulls had long vanished. Now both sides understood the same truth. The Hago was not a joke. It was a tragedy, a relic of a world that hadn't caught up to its own war. When the last Hago burned on Okinawa's hillsides, it marked not just the end of a tank, but the end of an idea, that faith could outrun physics. When the battlefields of the Pacific finally cooled, the Hago remained, not as a weapon, but as wreckage. At Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu, the beaches were littered with their carcasses. Sun-bleached hulls half buried in coral, turrets blown open, tracks twisted like melted wire. The tropical rains turned their interiors into rusted coffins. For the U.S. Marines, these wrecks became landmarks, points of reference in a chaotic landscape. "Meet me by the tank," they'd say, meaning the blackened shell that once terrified someone. American ordnance officers swarmed over the battlefields after the fighting, cataloging everything. They examined Hagos with clinical curiosity, measuring armor thickness, gun penetration, and design flaws. Their reports read like autopsies. Armor, ineffective against all standard U.S. infantry weapons. Gun, inadequate against any known Allied tank. Mobility, acceptable in soft terrain but limited in defensive positions. In one debriefing report from Tarawa, a Marine intelligence officer wrote bluntly, "These tanks have no business on a modern battlefield." Yet in that same report, under crew performance, he added a single note, "Fought to the last man." That contradiction, technical failure, human ferocity, defined Japan's armored legacy in World War II. The Marines' perspective. After the battles for many Marines, the Hago was their first close encounter with an enemy tank. They'd grown up hearing about German Tigers or Soviet monsters, but what they found in the Pacific was different, smaller, quieter, almost fragile. In interviews years later, veterans recalled how the Hago evoked mixed emotions, grim amusement, then respect. You couldn't believe a country like Japan that built those Zeros was sending these little things at us, one Marine said. But when you looked inside, you saw the photos, the family flags, and you realized, hell, those guys were just like us. Captured Hagos were shipped to Hawaii and the United States for testing and public display. Crowds at war bond rallies gathered to see the Japanese light tank. Children climbed on them. Soldiers posed beside them, and reporters joked about their cardboard armor. But for those who'd fought them, the laughter never felt right. They'd seen what it took to destroy even such fragile machines, the lives spent on both sides for yards of coral and jungle. The shift in American understanding in 1944, American analysts recognized that Japan's weakness in armor wasn't a flaw of incompetence. It was a flaw of circumstance. Japan's industry couldn't mass-produce heavier tanks, not while its shipyards, aircraft factories, and oil reserves were being consumed by the Navy's demands. Even if the Imperial Army had designed a tank equal to the Sherman, it would have been stranded, without the fuel, the shipping, or the spare parts to reach the Pacific Islands. So the Hago was not an accident. It was an inevitability, a machine shaped by Japan's geography, economy, and isolation. Still, for U.S. troops, that didn't soften the sight of what remained. Rows of wrecked Hagos, silent testimonies to courage undone by technology. A battlefield icon in time. The Hago became an unlikely icon of the Pacific War. It appeared in newsreels, museum exhibits, and training manuals. The image of Marines standing over its punctured hull became shorthand for the imbalance of the Pacific conflict, America's industrial might versus Japan's willpower. On Tarawa, one Hago was left intentionally in place, a rusted monument to the battle. Its gun still pointed seaward, its body frozen mid-defiance. Visitors decades later would touch its thin armor and marvel that men once went to war inside it. But the story of the Hago didn't end with the rusting wrecks. In the ashes of defeat, Japan would rebuild its identity and its technology on the lessons learned from these humble steel shells. In the months following Japan's surrender in August 1945, Allied intelligence teams combed through what was left of the Empire's war machine. In abandoned hangars and mountain caves, they found the bones of an industrial dream, blueprints for tanks that had never left the drawing board, half-built prototypes, and the rusting remnants of Hagos stripped for parts. For American analysts, it was like opening a time capsule of failure and brilliance intertwined. The Hago's simplicity fascinated them. 3 crew, a diesel engine, lightweight construction. It was outdated, yes, but ingenious in its efficiency. Built with the resources they had, not the ones they wished for, one engineer noted in a report from 1946. That summed up Japan's wartime dilemma perfectly. The Hago wasn't built to win an arms race. It was built to exist in a world where Japan could never match Western industry. A nation's reckoning post-war Japan faced a brutal reckoning. The same military that once preached the superiority of spirit over steel now lay discredited and dismantled. Tanks like the Hago, once paraded as symbols of empire, were melted down for scrap to rebuild cities. Yet even as Japan turned to peace, the lessons of the Hago lingered. Its failure became a quiet teacher. The engineers who had designed it went on to work in civilian industries, in automotive companies like Mitsubishi, Toyota, and Isuzu. They carried with them an obsession with efficiency, reliability, and adaptability born from wartime scarcity. The very principles that made the Hago possible lightweight design, mechanical simplicity, resourcefulness would later define Japan's industrial miracle. What began as a desperate tank became, indirectly, the DNA of Japan's post-war technological rise, historical perspective. The view from the Western historians initially dismissed the Hago as a footnote, a curiosity of the Pacific War. Compared to the thundering duels of Tigers and Shermans in Europe, the Hago seemed insignificant. But deeper study revealed something more profound. The Hago's story illustrated the geography of warfare. How where a nation fights determines how it fights. In the vast jungles and coral islands of the Pacific, mobility and simplicity were more practical than armor and firepower. Japan's error wasn't designing the Hago, it was believing that the same machine could fight forever in an evolving war. By the late 20th century, military scholars reevaluated it not as a bad tank, but as a good tank in the wrong war. It had been effective in China, adequate in 1939, useless by 1943. Its life cycle mirrored Japan's war itself, bold, swift, and ultimately unsustainable. Legacy and memory today. A few Hagos still survive, silent exhibits in museums across the world. One rests in the Yushuken Museum in Tokyo, restored to its former olive-green sheen. Another sits under the open sun in Hawaii, its hull pocked with bullet scars left untouched, as if to remind visitors of the laughter that once echoed over it. In Guam, locals still find fragments of their armor buried in coral sand. Each one tells the same story, of men who fought in machines that could not protect them, and of a nation that placed faith above metallurgy. The Hago's silhouette remains oddly iconic, a small tank that looks almost toy-like, innocent in its proportions. But behind that simplicity lies a tragedy that transcends steel, the tragedy of a generation that believed courage could outlast technology. When the war ended, Japan abandoned that illusion. The modern self-defense forces that arose decades later would carry a very different creed. That protection, not sacrifice, was the highest honor. And in that quiet transformation lies the Hago's final lesson, that even the weakest armor can leave the strongest mark on history. But history doesn't end with wreckage or reform. It ends with reflection. The Hago's story is more than a tale of machines. It's a mirror of humanity's most painful truth. Bravery is timeless, but technology is not. The Type 95 Hago still sits in the Pacific sun. Its steel faded to orange, its rivets blooming with rust. Tourists take photos beside it now, children climbing where men once burned. Time has gentled the wreckage, but not the meaning, because this was never just a story about a tank. It was about belief. The belief that courage could stand in for technology, that willpower could stop a bullet, that loyalty could armor the flesh. When U.S. Marines laughed on Tarawa, they weren't mocking the dead. They were reacting to the absurdity of war, that men could be sent into combat in something so fragile, so hopeless, and yet fight with such conviction. That laughter was disbelief turned into sorrow. The Hago represents the paradox of the Pacific War, a nation capable of brilliance in the air and at sea, yet trapped in outdated doctrines on land. Japan built the Zero fighter, elegant, deadly, revered, but its tanks were paper shells of misplaced confidence. And yet, inside those shells there was something eternal, duty, fear, love, a sense of purpose so absolute it defied logic. Every Hago that burned was a monument to human endurance, and to the cruel mathematics of industrial war, where faith meets factory output. In the end, the Hago didn't change the course of history, but it revealed it, showing how wars are not won by bravery alone, but by the ability to learn, adapt, and evolve. Its riveted plates became Japan's final lesson, that heroism without progress leads only to graves, and that the true strength of a nation lies not in how it dies for its ideals, but how it rebuilds from them. Today, in the quiet hum of Japan's factories and the sleek hum of its modern machines, you can almost hear the echo of the Hago, a whisper from the past, reminding us that every piece of rusted armor was once a dream, a fragile dream that drove straight into history and never came back.